2, 1. A bit of characterization and then 3 points from OG in this debate. Firstly, and why we have worse research in the status quo as a result of the dominance of left-wing in the academy. Secondly, why we have worse reception of research in the echelons of society that need to actually implement research outputs into policy. Lastly, and the quality of studies and why we create dumber students that quite frankly never challenge their own echo chambers. Before that, characterization. Firstly, status quo. How do we think that the left-wing bias in the academy looks like? And please note, this is a regrets motions, meaning that what is factually true in real life are stuff that we can assume and don't need to analyze them or likely to happen. The only part that is up for debate here is the counterfactual. What do we think is the status quo? A, vast majority of students in vast majority of universities are left-wing. Secondly, vast majority of people who are higher up in the university, professors, teaching assistants, etc., are also left-wing. Thirdly, we see this also taking place in forms of things such as cancel culture and deplatforming. We have seen students rioting in front of stages of speakers like Ben Shapiro or Jordan Peterson and kicking them out of universities proactively. We have seen even researchers being fired, such as in the case of, in the UK, a researcher that dared question whether or not putting trans women in prisons of women leads to more rape in prison, was fired just for conducting the research independent of any policy being conducted. These are status quo things that opposition needs to defend under their side. What do we think would happen on the counterfactual? We think that the general shift that was leading to more inclusion in general and the existence of liberal views in universities would have happened anyway. Why? A, there was vast pressure, especially like during the 60s and like the rise of the second wave of feminism, etc., to increase inclusivity and accessibility in universities. This is particularly because A, they are funded by taxpayers, so everyone wants them to be accessible, and B, because there is a scream from inside that there is a very significant echo chamber and we need to have more opinions. They just shifted this pendulum too far to the other side, leading to today a different kind of echo chamber. Secondly, we think liberal views were always prominent in universities and to an extent would always exist. This is because of the tendency of researchers to be willing to question the status quo and ask questions about the world, try and find out more new things and change it. This is why we have seen most of it coming from universities and why we think left-wing in universities would exist anyway. The difference is on our side there would be balance. You would hear both sides of the political spectrum. Clarifications before I get to my points. Cool. Let's talk about research. Why do we think it's worse? Firstly, in the very conducting of what the research question is and what we are even willing to research into. We think A, the fact that the vast majority of researchers come from the same worldview means that we get very little diversity of research questions and very little ability for them to question each other. Even in groups of researchers, when 5 different people conduct research together, it is extremely likely that all 5 of these people today will be of the same political view. This is particularly important in the social studies, which are more prone to being impacted by different biases, which means you would only ask in the first place questions such as what are the social pressures that lead women to not study STEM as opposed to what are the reasons that women study STEM less. Maybe there is a biological aspect to it. We won't know if we won't research it, but the question is never being asked because the premises are the same among all researchers. Secondly, even if someone
through the general progression in society towards left-wing views, in the past, right-wing views were often abhorrent, so I do think they have to stand behind a large amount of funding for eugenics research, large amounts of viewpoints that said that black people were subhuman in the United States and used to justify segregation and things like this. They do have to stand behind the funding and proliferation of a vastly larger number of unethical studies. What is the comparative? The comparative is liberal ideas within universities, and note that there needs to be a dominance as a point of framing, because without the dominance, there's likely to be more gridlock in university policy, is how you get things like consent and bodily autonomy and regulations and ethics boards to come about in the first place that regulate the degree to which you can exploit students, that regulate the degree to which you can exploit students for their studies, and that regulate the degree to which you conduct exploitive research that's bad and discriminates against communities. So for those reasons, we create the regulatory environment that Hadar says is good that stops these bad things from happening. What is the framing of our case? We think that Hadar is right that people are generally better off when they're exposed to a balance of competing views throughout their lifetime, and that there's a balance of competing ideological views in society. This is true insofar as the median person is someone who benefits most from access to information and the capacity to shift their opinion on the basis of exposure to competing views. The benefit of the dominance of left liberal views at university is that they've traditionally been a countervailing narrative to the class tendencies of elites and regular people to move towards social and fiscal conservatism outside university. That is, in their professional life once they leave, and in their home life before they enter. Thereby, we create a governing class of people, a class of educated people, that are far more aware of the conditions of structural oppression that created them, while simultaneously being exposed to a far greater diversity of viewpoints. Why do we think that on balance, people who attend university are likely exposed to countervailing and conservative views outside society? This answers all of the OG claims about echo chambers. Firstly, note that the corporate and work world tends to be highly individualistic. That is to say that bosses and supervisors tend to proffer perspectives, views that are highly right-wing. As a gut check for this, the largest largest white-collar sector in the USA is the private insurance industry, which is highly ideologically homogenous. So even if you come out of university with left-wing views, you're likely to spend 20, 30 years afterward surrounded by conservatives who implicitly influence the way you think, even if your views never change, and are far more likely to change your viewpoint just by virtue of in-group biases and selections. So what this means is we give these 4-year period where you get exposure to a diversity of views outside that. But secondly, rich white men control most media channels. While this has liberalized, historically this was far more homogenous. So the kinds of media that was disseminated through TV shows, movies for years and years and years that you watched while growing up, promoted the idea of individualism, showed narratives that said pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and excluded minorities to a massive degree, thereby making it less likely that people access the idea of social progressivism at the opt-in point. But thirdly, intergenerational transfer of belief through things like religion. Note that generational liberalization means that parents are more likely to be conservative than you, and often these people have highly proximate influence on your life. So when you're growing up, you're more likely to adopt your parents' political views rather than like developing on your own, because they're most likely to be the person who interacts with you the most, who talks to you about politics at the dinner table, and things like this. Finally, class solidarity among wealthy people, country clubs, and so on and so forth also proffer these kinds of views and indoctrinate you into this. Finally, access to YouTube. People can see researchers and Ben Shapiro online, and insofar as algorithms have a bias toward right wing, they're going to push that on either side. What this means is that on balance, it's likely there's already a significant amount of exposure that people get exposed to countervailing views. This means the echo chambers argument from OG does not work. Now, OG, to their credit, tries to preempt this by saying, but you don't read Milton Friedman. Instead, you get exposed to bad, straw-manish conservative views. I think the volume and diversity of sources we prove on our side of the house exists, and you don't get exposed to that lack of nuance. But more importantly, I don't think this debate will be won or lost on which book you read or how in-depth you went into the critique of Marxism on either side. Rather, it's about the value system you take away from university and the way it influences the way society develops in retrospect. So I don't think that argument holds weight in the round. Why in retrospect would the absence of this norm means you get worse education? Note that the purpose of university, I think, is to educate an understanding of socially utile values throughout society. So if we prove that we do that for more people, we win the debate. Why do we need dominance? Note that university boards are comprised of a large number of people. Donors, professors, people in the university administration, all of these individuals. Note that at the point at which you have the dominance of a specific viewpoint, this creates the pressure to become ideologically inclusive and overcome gridlock in policymaking. Why has the left historically done this well? Note that they typically do not stifle speech insofar as they commit to liberal values, and there tends to be a gradient of left-wing views that are acceptable in university. That is, it is unlikely to be a race to the bottom in terms of economic policy. I think that medical associations and a variety of other groups study the other things. I think that that's fine. Moving on. I think the first thing that they do is they teach a variety of perspectives within the left liberal milieu. So it's not just teaching orthodox Marxism. In fact, there's an incentive to do this to avoid critique from external sources. In fact, when you have this dominance perspective, there's likely more pushes and more scrutiny on academia in general, which is likely to produce a diversity of perspectives within academia. Obviously, it will still be left liberal bias, but there will be diversity within that. That means it's not going to be monomaniacally echo-chambery. But secondly, inclusion for minorities. On their side of the house, you never get programs like affirmative action, or programs that offer scholarships to marginalized people, because the dominant ideological space within university is one that is less likely to include them. But even if not, even if there's still some left-wing bias, there's more gridlock in those kinds of things, so it happens slower in retrospect on their side. So you get more inclusive universities on our side. But thirdly, you don't get as inclusive policies. Things like safe spaces on university campuses only exist because of the left-wing dominance in academia. So you push people like professors and university administrators to create more amenities by which students are better able to access space within the university where they feel safe and happy and so on. What is the weighing on this argument? Note that firstly, even if the quality of education is slightly worse, the policies and the dominance of these views push more inclusion in the first place. So even if we can't win the deadlock on who gets better university education, we get more people exposed to university because more minorities and more people who otherwise never access university get in on our side. But secondly, we've given reasons to believe the quality of education is better as well. But thirdly, we give people access to diversity of experience because insofar as the perspectives otherwise they're exposed to are duplicative, we outweigh. The final claim I want to make is now elites are more likely to support left-wing causes. Note that at the point at which they go through this education system, they're more likely to form ties and connections with people they associate within university, so they're more likely to become socially progressive and push for those things en masse. On the balance and on the margins, this leads to more inclusive policy over a period of time within society. Even if on aggregate that's a small impact, it's still better than what OG ran. Incredibly proud to stand in opening up.
Podium a second. Okay, I think this will work. I'm gonna start my speech after a sip of water.
Okay, going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1. I'm going to have 2 points of important clarification. Then I'm going to weigh our impacts in 2 ways. I'm going to explain why it's more important than just like the general how much people study within university, and I'm going to weigh it over safe spaces and engagement with people with that. First of all, a few points of characterization and framing. The first thing I want to note is that Matt doesn't actually answer any of Hadar's analysis on research, right? She gave like 4 actual reasons why we get less of this research. Matt is just like, no, there's still some incentive to do it. That's not an answer, that's parallel analysis. What Hadar explains to you is that the perception of people, of how they're going to be interacted with, how other people are going to view them, how their the other professors within their department are going to behave to them, how the students are going to react to them, and the risk of deplatforming and the risk of cancel culture affecting them means that not only are they not suggesting these ideas in the first place, but universities are also scared to take that step as well. No answers, analysis still stands. Second, characterization on what right-wing ideas actually are, right? Because not all right-wing people are just inherently racist and hate everyone that isn't like them. What we think represents right-wing ideas is 2 things. A, yes, conservatism. This doesn't mean that there's no openness to change. It just means that the threshold for making that change is higher, and the actual research and desire to take things into account that have been like this for years and understand why they have been that way and maybe not wanting to change that exists, so that they are skeptical of change. But second, we just think that like more capitalism and support for small government things, and also lastly, a belief in equality of opportunity and not equality of outcomes. We think all of these things represent right-wing ideas, and they can't just claim it's going to be racist, it's going to be eugenics. We don't think that in reality most right-wing people believe in this. Please, no generalizations about right-wing people as well in this space. Then they tell us, but there's going to be competition, and there are think tanks, and there are other people that do this, and also there are ethics boards and a push to do this. First of all, what we think is a reality check. We all know that cancel culture exists. They have to defend status quo. That is the definition of a regrets debate. So this does happen, at least to some extent. 2, we just think that when we show you that the strong dominant left wing gave more power to student unions, gave more power to student clubs to make demands and make decisions within university, and universities, especially most Ivy Leagues, being for-profit universities, means that the students are the most powerful actor when it comes to impacting the universities at the end of the day because they want profit. So it's not enough to just tell us donors and things like that. We showed you why these are the most important people. But also, even if you get it from other places like think tanks, why is just like listening to that not enough? A, you take into account less seriously what you hear from university in the 4 years that they want you to if you know that there's a dominant left-wing bias and you don't trust what people are telling you and the professors are telling you. This means that even if what they want to achieve is people like engaging with liberal ideas that they wouldn't engage with otherwise, we don't think they actually achieve that, because people coming in who know there's a left-wing bias don't engage with them, don't critically think with it. When professors start talking about things that are left-wing, they're just like, my parents warned me about this. And notice they concede that so many powerful people who are role models to you in your life are going to be conservative and are going to believe those things. Your parents, your employer outside, the people you look up to, and the businesses you want to go into. It's unclear why in those 4 years when there's just some professor you haven't met before is telling you these ideas, you're necessarily engaging with them instead of knowing in advance that they're not going to help you outside, and therefore they're not going to. But lastly, we think that even if there is some other places that are think tanks, we think what you get is a divide. Some people only listening to those think tanks, some people only listening to the left-wing bias in university, and what you don't get is engagement by both sides. We think that universities uniquely, when they're balanced, have the ability to be, no, we put in actual research. No, we have publicized in like important places. No, we have the name of Ivy League research that is very high level, and you can't just criticize us for being funded by people who are politically biased or anything like that. So it's critically important that places with that kind of status within society create this research so that it's listened to at the end of the day. And I think that's all I have to say. Let's explain what our actual impacts are. I think there's 2 important impacts. One is a loss of opportunity. We explained to you why this research has an incredible ability to help the exact groups that they want to help, right? If periods and the hormones associated with them make me less rational and less likely to succeed when I make decisions when I'm on my period, and research into that can help me understand how to prevent or what medication I can take in order to make that better, then that is going to be an active, helpful thing in my life. If we lose even a single research, we think that's an important thing. But also, We think that there are even larger impacts because if you study into hormone imbalances or levels of testosterone in women that make them more susceptible to either rape or violence, researching into that makes it more likely that you understand solutions and that you take the steps necessary to prevent actual crimes. We also think that it can cause active harm because when you don't look into the reasons for something and you just base on your assumptions, you're doing things that are actively bad. So if you pushed women into STEM without taking into account the biological differences that make it maybe harder for them to, or not even harder for them to study them in different ways, and you don't look into that, then you're pushing them into systems and resources that aren't good for them, which means at best a waste of resources, and at worst, less belief in their ability to succeed, not because they can't understand it, because the system isn't built for them to understand it well. Why is this more important than anything else? But before that, closing.
The base characterizations of OG are just unreasonable. For some reason, all progressives or radical Marxists are on your side. People like Jordan Peterson, who actively deny that trans women or women want equal opportunity?
No, I'm not necessarily defending just Jordan Peterson. I can say that it's good that he doesn't do his research and that it's bad that other people don't do their research. But also, I don't think we're being unreasonable. I think what we're characterizing is what it looks like in real life when the dominance of left-wing and liberal things cause less, when it's so dominant that it causes less of that research. Why is this more important than the unique impacts of, than the impacts of these people having a safe space in university? Two reasons. One, we just think that the kind of policies you're likely to get from these research help significantly more of these people at the end of the day. Because many minorities don't have access to university, but when you have research that helps many people throughout, it doesn't matter if they go through university, you're actively helping many people outside of that. But also, we just think that if the employers and if the rich white men that OO concede are the powerful people in society don't take seriously or into account these universities, then just going to those universities isn't necessarily going to help them get ahead in life. So we think we significantly help those people more. But we also think that it's more impactful than how you study, because without research, you don't get the ability to criticize without credence. And we just think that it's the most unique impacts that you can get from university, because critical thinking you learn elsewhere, and when you don't take university seriously, you don't get that anyways. For those reasons, please propose.
Everybody ready? 3, 2, 1. Universities don't have a left-wing bias. Truth has a left-wing bias. I'm going to tell you why we clearly win this debate, but first I want to delete and dismantle the OG case. The first thing they say, on their large cases based on research, the first thing they say is you get the same questions being asked. I don't think this is true because different questions come from diversities of life experiences, not necessarily viewpoints, i.e. growing up black, growing up poor, being from a different part of the world. So I think that mechanism is marginal. But secondarily, I'm going to flip it. Liberal and left-wing views are structured around questioning the assumptions of society, assumptions about traditionalism and conservative status quo biases, and who is legitimate and who is not, and who's worthy of studying. So I think I flipped that. But the second thing they say is there's a perception of people that creates a chilling effect. One note, regardless, there's uncertainty about how your supervisor or other people will evaluate you and what their biases are, no matter what the general culture is. But secondarily, I think there's largely still a chilling effect on their side, and it gets worse. Why? Because note when it's not dominant, it is far easier for the right or center-right to crowd out liberal views and minorities on their side. Why? One note, because minorities are structurally disadvantaged compared to like Chad Foxworth, who had the ability to get tutoring and build better argumentation in classes. Or secondarily, on our side, even if there's a cancel culture, there's an environment of student unions that create amenities to push for more inclusion, safe spaces and mental health services that allow students to understand, for example, like the feelings that they felt in class and being able to share their opinions more and be safe. In other words, I think students comparatively disengage much more on their side compared to our side. But I want to be very clear for why it doesn't get worse and mitigate their entire case. Matt told you a bunch of stuff. Tamar's response was two things. One, it's insufficient because we didn't engage with competing analysis, or we didn't give superior analysis, it was only competing. And the second thing is reality check. Those are insufficient responses. To match responses, I'm going to beat those responses. Firstly, there's a competitive incentive to diversify and bring new questions to the tables between journals and researchers themselves. You can't keep asking the same questions. You need to bring a new and novel idea to try to get published. Secondarily, this is critical. There's no analysis for why a university classroom and the culture in the classroom is associated or linked with the high-level research that is actually done by the professors. So when they go into the lab, when they go out and conduct surveys, there's no actual link for it between a university culture that is done and the actual research that they say is provided. And note, those are largely quite separate departments with separate pools of funding. But thirdly, note, state funding still represents the general populace views. And the university depends a lot on that state funding for research, which has very clear legal obligations to be non-partisan, to not, for example, only ask particular questions. But also notes maths analysis on ethics boards are structurally have a legacy of being independent, where they get literally people with that diversity of viewpoints. So note that the response to ethics boards was also asserted. I beat their assertive response to maths analysis. But secondarily, why do universities likely do it well? Firstly, these tend to be spaces that encourage debate and quality of argumentation. Professors want their students to engage with the material. They want them to have lively classrooms. Secondarily, note that it allows that a university space is a place that allows students to take risks and not form ideas out of desperation, but stable conditions. So even if, for example, they feel like they were shut out in the classroom by like the 20 liberal kids that dunked on the conservative kid, he's still in a stable condition where he can go and question those ideas afterwards. But thirdly, note, I think it's likely more incredibly inclusive. Why? Firstly, there's a competitive incentive between universities and classes to recruit more students, to not shut out people. Secondarily, they have legal obligations to be non-partisan, so they can't prevent conservative speakers from coming, even if students try to boycott it and protest it, because they're legally obligated to be non-partisan and not ban a particular viewpoint. Thirdly, they have the incentive to not be demonized in the media, like Matt tells you. But fourthly, they have financial incentives to not turn away moderate students and parents and to try to recruit as many people as possible. Tamar says, but it still creates some degree of a divide, right? But this analysis explains why there's not a chasm. But here's why it's likely there's symmetrically a divide still on their side. One, insofar as algorithms still push people aside. Secondarily, political entrepreneurs that have incentives to be divisive. But thirdly, note, the burden is on them to prove why there isn't a divide, not for us to rebut or explain why there isn't a divide. But finally, I'm going to flip it if you don't buy any of that. The alternative of funding they talk about still get funded from conservative think tanks, but there's virtually no left-leaning ones. But I'm going to be very particular here. The reason why there's an absence is because left and liberal views don't have financial incentives behind them. The upshot is, where funding exists to inform questions that matter to society, we need universities to solve the market gap that provides the space already for right-leaning funding, but virtually no left-leaning funding. I think on their side, there's still a divide insofar as there's still a race to the bottom by conservatives if they monopolize the space to be the most outlandish, to try to recruit the most amount of people and to rise to the top in terms of the viewpoints they do, if it exists symmetrically with left-leaning viewpoints. So if you buy none of this, at the very least, the divide is a wash on their side. Now, what are the other channels that provide a counter to the left? And this is crucial, because Matt explained why there's a diversity of channels to your right-leaning viewpoints. Universities are virtually the only spaces that have power in society that can counter these viewpoints. The alternative avenues are things like traditions and norms via religious institutions that have incentive to be regressive, not to question the logical perfection of the creator and his laws. Capitalist society that creates one competitiveness of the job market that makes everybody zero-sum and individualistic and anti-redistribution, or the owners of capital pushing for norms and narratives that are anti-left. Literally the Koch brothers funding think tanks and news agencies pushing the meritocracy narrative, or the fact with inequality rising and groups of people are pitted against each other and fight for the crumbs that are left. The upshot of this, if it's unclear whether or not the left-leaning views are good or bad, or you prefer right or the center is correct, we win because we explain to you why it provides the most balance and diversity of views and values for society to choose from. This is why it must be dominant in universities, because it can't be dominant anywhere else. Back up, do you have a PY?
Take one.
Yeah.
All of your analysis on universities having an incentive to create a balanced research exists on our counterfactual as well. The part that is unique is the dominance of the left wing that you have to accept in the status quo, and the reluctance to accept the results of the research on your side of the debate.
I gave you like 4 mechanisms why there isn't a reluctance to accept the answers to the questions, why there's incentive to promote new questions and competitive incentives to create new answers as well. I engage with that, but also note, if they say that there's an incentive to be diverse with the research on both sides, that's the only mutually exclusive benefit. So that means that wash is the only comparative they have. Our mutually exclusive benefit is providing avenues for minorities where they otherwise can't access it. If you buy none of this, why are left-leaning values inherently good, and what are they characterized as? I already explained to you why they're probably going to be to some degree inclusive, but it is inherently change-making or progressive. That is to say, liberalism in the left is structurally based on questioning societal assumptions. This is good because we would prefer to experiment with our values and have a constant body questioning the ones that exist, but secondarily, elites are more likely to be socially progressive and redistributive. They meet people, they engage with a culture that tells them and shapes and reorients their values that they otherwise would not have. These elite change makers affect everyone else in society. They need to have an avenue that inculcates them with something that tells them to care more about themselves. Vote for truth, vote for left-wing bias.
It's the exact right combo of cringe and adorable.
I love you. That's what I call Davis.
There are two things that we agree with opening opposition on. Firstly, some left-wing ideas are good, and secondly, it is true that right-wing ideas still exist in the world, that right-wing research still occurs on side government. This speech, then, will elegantly prove that the good left-wing ideas are weakened and less effective on side opposition, and that the right-wing ideas are poorer quality when right-wing ideas are marginalized from universities and the productive discussion that they create. The first thing I want to do, though, is some weighing on inclusion. Because if in this speech I can prove to you that inclusion on side opposition is confined to universities and that echo chambers get worse, inclusion in universities is just not a benefit. Because the second that students get out of universities, they are then subjected to a world that is far more right-wing, far more polarized, and far more antagonistic than the world would bring you on side opposition. All right, two extensions then. Firstly, why research is worse on side opposition, and then secondly, why good and useful left-wing research is less effective in their world. Firstly then, on right-wing research. The weighing of this point, I think, is that at worst, this increases a margin because it doubles the harm, right? So I think opening opposition explains why maybe left-wing research is worse in an echo chamber, but we double that by explaining why right-wing, whatever that word, is also worse. But secondly, it also fills, I think, quite an important gap by explaining what happens to right-wing views, when they're marginalized from the academy. A few things to say here. Firstly, where does right-wing research occur? Now, we actually agree, I suppose, with opening opposition that it likely occurs in think tanks and in privately funded studies. But the simple reason why it occurs there is because it doesn't occur in universities, right? Like, the fact that these views are marginalized from universities, the fact that they do not attract university funding, is why then private institutions come in and fund those studies, because there are, of course, still incentives to fund and influence research, and there are, of course, a bunch of reasons why the right wing is relatively rich, but that means that research still exists, it just does not exist in universities in their world. And why is that far, far worse? Well, the first thing to say is it's much less accountable, and that's just because it's not subject to all of the checks and balances that makes research in universities relatively good. It's not subject to standards of replicability, it's not peer reviewed, it's grey literature, which still gets incorporated into people's literature reviews, it still gets taken into account by governments, but it doesn't enter the discourse in academia, where it might be sense-checked, where it might be held to account. But secondly, as they note, it's privately funded in a way which is far more opaque than funding for universities, which is to say that because think tanks are set up in order to advance specific policy goals, you now have right-wing research which is far less accountable, but also, I suppose, just far less unbiased. It's not coming to particularly useful conclusions necessarily. So I think that means two important impacts occur. The first thing to say is that when good right-wing ideas exist, they are not adequately engaged with by the academy. Like, they're grey literature, they're not necessarily taken seriously by researchers, so you do not get as much innovation on their side because those good ideas are excluded from circulation. But those ideas still do impact policy making because, of course, governments take into account things like policy white papers that occur from like independent studies or whatever. The final thing I'm going to do here is just explain why universities comparably are an especially good place to have these discussions. That is, as I've already be explained because of the rigor in those institutions, but additionally because they're particularly prominent. That is to say that discourse that occurs, sit down, in universities, is relatively subject to social scrutiny at large. It's not as opaque as I've described. But thirdly, it's because, the alternatives are things like social and mainstream media, where people subject things to far less logical scrutiny, where people think far less deeply about them. And so I think all of this material allows us to co-opt what we hear at DLO about think tanks so incredibly neatly, right? We explain to you that think tanks are terrible. They're toxic influences in academia. We would far prefer that left-wing people in universities had to genuinely argue against those ideas, had to genuinely incorporate them into their research where they were relevant, than simply exclude them and say, because they're right-wing, they're not worth engaging with. That is untrue. You ought to engage with them on their merits. That occurs in the academy. Before I move on to some stuff about good and useful left-wing research, I'm going to take opening.
Cool. Think tanks exist on both sides and also have competitive incentives and regulations to weed out bad studies. But when a degree is a prerequisite to access a good job in the first place, I prefer university administrators who push for policies that include more people in university spaces in the first place, thereby allowing more people to access capital, jobs, things like this.
Three things to say here. Firstly, on inclusion, I think there are very strong incentives for universities to include as many students as they can. Those are commercial incentives, right? Yeah. The second thing to say is I've explained at the outset of this point why think tanks are more likely in your world because they are excluded from the academy. The third thing to say is, as I've already explained, they do not have the incentive to do better research. They have the incentive to do research which appeals to the ideology and the intentions of that think tank and their funders. You need to respond to that. Alright, why then does good and useful left-wing research get less effective in their world? The way here is, if the left-wing is good, this argument explains why leftists are worse at being left-wing, but it also provides better and stronger reasons than opening government does why this deletes buy-in to universities. So firstly, this makes leftism more elitist. That is to say, firstly, that it means left-wing intuitions are expressed in opaque language that people structurally misinterpret. Look, for example, how easy it is for the right-wing to demonize critical race theory, because people don't fucking understand it. It's expressed in incredibly opaque terms that do not make sense to people, that are unintuitive. Secondly, the people who structurally get access to the platforms to advocate for left-wing beliefs now are more elite. They are people who can access university and who then reap the salary dividends that going to university provides. Thirdly, this creates a sense that left-wingness is correlated with intelligence. Like, that's something a lot of left-wing people, CDLO, actively say. They say truth is left-wing. They say the reason why the academy is more left-wing is because smart people are more left-wing. That makes leftists look terrible. It makes them look, excuse the Australian language, like absolute fucking cunts. That is so bad for the perception of left-wing ideas. It means that people take them far less seriously in their world. But also, leftist students crucially get worse at argumentation. They spend all their time engaging in stupid infighting about, like, I don't know, some left-wing idea, rather than actually, like, honing argumentation against right-wing people. So if you believe them that right-wing ideas are bad, it is better that young people who are intelligent, who are given all the resources that allow them to become good arguers, have to practice it at university. Additionally, though, this creates a demonization of intellectualism on the right wing, which is incredibly bad. It creates resentment at narratives of intellectualism of the left amid people who do not have access to university. And it creates political rewards for right-wing people to ridicule research or intellectualism. And that means four things. It means there are cuts to funding of universities. It means there's a loss of trust in experts. But it also means that right-wing populism gets worse because there's just so, this hands right-wing populists the ability to pretend that being smart is a bad thing, to pretend that research is not worth engaging with. And it also stops the left from being able to engage in that properly. Because left-wing people become so elite, so intellectualized, they are not able to engage with populists. They can't, engage, look at the way that liberals struggle to engage with populists because they're so truth-pilled. They can't, actually dissect this. Right-wing people then get access to emotion, they get access to resentment, they get access to easy and successful narratives that the elites are stacked against poorer people who cannot access universities. If you believe that the left is good, you shouldn't handicap them in the way that opening opposition and I suppose closing opposition does. So proud to affirm.
Thank you, government member Hadar, my opposition member.
Can I be heard? Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, and 1. Closing opposition has two main extensions. The first is we're going to win the characterization debate by placing pressure on the weak point of government, which is why is it that they will trend towards a conservative right-wing dominance, And secondly, we're going to ask a braver question than opening opposition. By asking what are the preconditions of change, we will go beyond just inclusion in universities, but we're going to ask the questions: how do you get these vulnerable groups into power? How do you keep them safe? And how do you make research for their needs? Before I move on, I have 2 points of direct response towards closing government. The first point is when they say think tanks are much worse for right-wing research. The first response to this is that a university that is dominantly left-wing would have all the incentives to criticize, review this researches, which means at minimum there's like no change because there's still incentives to check and balances. Secondly is that there's a paucity of good research for good left-wing ideas, which is why it demands an asymmetry in left-wing circles in universities, because by definition they are newer ideas and hence there's less research on them. But thirdly and lastly is that if universities are a good place to have institutional research, then at minimum this minimizes and marginalizes the open and government benefit, which means we're happy to have that be a contribution to the round because it makes our path much easier. The second response is when they say it looks perceptually bad to people on the ground because of intellectual truth-pilling. The first thing is to say is that the counterfactual is that they are misrepresented as uneducated unionists. At minimum, if both depictions are bad, then you would rather have the depiction that allows them to participate in intellectualized circles like politics and have their views be represented in the public. And secondly is that in comparison, right, this shields workers. At least they're not faced with massive amounts of discrimination from the right wing, and you create strong incentives on the right wing to massively represent these people more, which means on comparative you improve incentives on the right wing. So maybe the second argument is true. This is flip and a benefit for closing opposition. So you can credit these as 2 substantive contributions for closing opposition. We now move on to the first extension, which is winning the characterization debate. The counterfactual that Gov has to defend is the dominance of conservatism. Opening opposition relies on some pretty extreme characterizations about this, and we also flag some of them in our POIs. So we're going to show why you can claim some of these to be true on government bench, and why it's impossible to dislodge them without the dominance of the left wing. There are 3 ways in which this happens. The first is that there is a natural incentive to regress towards conservatism without a pre-existing dominance. That is, there's an incentive to target rich students, white students that are low risk and are likely to succeed within the structures of corporatism and are likely to come back and become rich alumni. Which means over time, without a dominance, there is a constant and persistent regression towards a dominant right-wing influence. Secondly is that universities tend to be echo chambers and trend towards some form of intellectual dominance because they have to suck up to university politics because they tend to be echo chambers, as government says, for many of their reasons. So we can claim these reasons to be true, and if they are true, then if it's not left-wing dominance, something else will arise to be dominant, which is the right wing. But the third and final point for why it tends towards right-wing dominance is that they tend to be highly competitive, which means when OO says gridlock, the reason for why we can weaponize is because this inefficiency, time spent on internal university politics disputes instead of having a harmonized university politics and direction, means that universities are spending more time on this and less time competing with other universities, which means that the ones that intake the most people, the ones that become the most successful, are the ones with some form of intellectual dominance. Which means that on a government bench, they tend towards becoming more and more conservative, more and more radical over time. Because as we've seen, if left-wing universities have become more radical and radical over time, and without this dominance, they become more right-wing and more right-wing over time. How should you situate this argument within the round? The first thing is, most obviously, it destroys the point on some dominance and some radicalism, because if we observe that this right-wing radicalism persists on government bench, at minimum it is the same. But the second thing is we observe that it actually gets substantially worse for the reason that if some people are shut out on both sides, the problem is that the people on our side that are vulnerable never get included into anything else. A right-winger can hide their beliefs, but you cannot for the foreseeable future hide your gender, hide your accent, hide your racial features, which means in closing opposition, we get these people included in the first place, which is a prerequisite to any other benefit in the round. But secondly is that they also have alternatives, as government says, to participate in politics outside, but only closing opposition provides them the safe space that does not mutually exclusively exist on a government bench. So this first argument concludes the round, as well as allows us to unlock a large margin of benefits that opening opposition receives responses to, and beyond that widens this by showing we actually get increasingly extreme representations, 1 over time, 2 for the research that is most important for people on the ground, and 3 particularly the ones that are most harmful and damaging to people. Opening government.
Any impact in this debate relies on implementation of research, which makes our analysis and reception logically prior to the benefits of both right-wing and left-wing research. We also showed right-wing research is alienated from universities which CG
So the first POI and the response to that is quite simply, if it is perceived as a right-wing dominance, no one will listen to you as well for similar reasons. Secondly, if it is the case, right, that it is the right wing being dominant, then no left-wing people will listen to you as well. And the problem is that the policies most important to implement are the groups that the left wing is targeting. Those that need policy reform for minimum wage. Those that need access to affirmative action. These are the groups that the left are particularly targeting, and these are the ones that we most need to improve society for. So maybe if it is a trade-off about who's listening, we would rather have the people on opposition bench listening. Let's move on to the second argument, the dynamics and the braver question of this debate. Opening opposition says inclusion, but closing government is right. There are incentives to inclusion on both sides. This debate is about why you need dominance. There are two reasons why. The first is that dominance is necessary for protection. Vital protections that would otherwise preclude your ability to learn, preclude your ability to get promoted, such as pride parades, protections for pronouns and dead naming, protections for sexual harassment that were at the time very controversial and among the first protections to ever be implemented in society in the 1900s and so on. And the reason for why dominance is necessary is because balance is fine for equality. Balance is fine for, opportunity of equality, but not fine for fixing the actual unequal structures inherent to that system and to society in the first place. So one, you have the structures necessary to protect people, either by having safe spaces exist in the first place or having directed structures for their benefit. But secondly is that the output and top level direction of research. So if both teams have some research directed towards some people, our research specifically targets the groups that the left wing cares about the most. This is the research that is most oftentimes, one, underused and neglected, and two, research that is often hardest to convince people of, but are typically the most important because the groups that the left wing fight for, such as the people in developing countries, such as the people in gender minorities and racial minorities, tend to be underrepresented in political systems, such as in healthcare research, vaccine research for tropical diseases, or research on African American studies, and even being able to justify the funding the department in the first place. This clearly is the most important impact in the round. What is the weighing point for this extension? The first is directly over opening opposition. We don't just show that they get into universities, but that they get into power in universities, that they are likely to stay in universities, not feel excluded, and go into positions of power, come out and promote businesses in their communities, and genuinely contribute to society. As a matter of priority as well, this outweighs government on value. The diversity of opening government might be one of political views that already exists in status quo or is marginal, but the one in closing opposition is one of background, of ideas that are deeply unheard by the political system, one where people are not considered people until they come into university and come out and contribute to that society. Closing opposition shows you the most important margin in the debate, and that's why closing opposition wins.
I'm going to structure this whip speech around our extensions because they clearly win us the debate. Firstly, why does this weaken the left? Secondly, why does it embolden the right? Why does it weaken the left? What we say very clearly at Ellie, to pretty minimal response from that speaker, is that the left structurally becomes more elitist, that universities hire overwhelmingly privileged and educated people, that social justice rhetoric is rendered in academic jargon, that universities and their sense of justice increasingly sideline class to the exclusion of identity. We explain that this demonizes intellectualism. I know that there are huge harms of this. It means that, for instance, scientific claims about whether climate change is real or vaccines are good become a matter of politics, not a matter of fact. And it also means, thirdly, that leftist students are just far worse at argument because they are unfamiliar with conservative premises because they are only used to infighting. I note here that opening government says, well, students exist in an echo chamber, and that's bad because they don't moderate their views. Our claim is a much more important one, which is not that they don't moderate their views and become more centrist, it is that they become worse leftists. We get three challenges to this. Firstly, I'll deal with opening opposition. Their main claim is that leftist research is actually good because it's moderated by a desire for funding and the intellectual heterogeneity of the left. Opening government contests this, but I'm going to explain much more powerfully that opening opposition's own mechanisms cause increasing radicalization and infighting among the left. So I'll flip that claim. That's firstly because leftists now have to compete for grants with people who share their own views rather than people who oppose you. That means you actually have an economic and professional incentive to demonize fellow leftists. You want to say that your fellow feminists are evil because they are insufficiently anti-carceral, for instance, so that you get that grant rather than them. Secondly, because the proximate enemy is other leftists. That is the literature available to you. Those are the departments that you work in. And thirdly, because on their side, it perversely becomes boundary pushing or edgy to support conservatism. That is not the world that we support. Secondly, because there is a context of increasing special specialization in universities as they get less and less funding, which means people have to narrow their focuses, have to say, no, my version of Marxist theory is better than yours. And thirdly, I note that if their mechanism is like, well, conservatives race to the bottom, unclear why that doesn't apply to leftists too, that clearly flips opening opposition. And I just note that the economic incentives of academics caring about their own career progression are way more impactful and proximate to those academics than just an altruistic desire for discourse or general political commitments. What challenges do we hear to our argument from closing opposition? The first claim they make, kind of a rehashing of opening opposition, is just that the counterfactual is right-wing dominance. The first thing I want to just observe is that if the claim from their opening is correct, that the truth leans towards the left anyway, that means that probably in either world, academics still have some motivation to, for instance, do research into climate change. But I would note, secondly, that their mechanisms are pretty shaky. They say you have a natural incentive to target low-risk, rich students, right, who are going to be privileged. But the problem with that is they do not prove why these universities are genuinely left-wing, why the material reasons we explained at Ellie, that universities are structurally elite, rich, and privileged, are stronger than just the gestures, the PR that universities can do to brand themselves as leftist. All that extension or mechanism explains is that students who maybe are wealthy become performatively left-wing on their side, that they just take up left-wing commitments in a very trivial sense, that they do not enact them, that they do not get the training to make those clear. That is our extension. The third thing we hear from closing opposition is that you need leftist dominance to have protection of students. This is like a pretty analytically bare argument. And I think firstly that left-wing students obviously still exist on our side. Maybe there are fewer than there are on theirs. I can test that for the reasons already given. But you still get enough to, for instance, get autonomous organizing spaces. It's incredibly unclear why you need 70% of your campus to be left-wing in order to have support for a queer space on your campus, in order to have support for student unionism. I think it is often better, for instance, we are less exclusionary because there may be, for instance, queer or gay right-wing students who want to engage in queer spaces on campus, but who feel locked out of that because they do not hold the political commitments that even if in a trivial sense, students feel that they have to abide by. That is why our extension is incredibly important. What's the second part of it? It is why this emboldens the right. We explained right-wing research gets worse. It is outsourced to think tanks where it is unaccountable, it is not visible, it is not subject to peer review, and it is privately funded. On the comparative, that research goes to universities because people then care about things like intellectual interest or visibility. We think clearly there is a change. And there's huge impact, right? Because that kind of research, those white papers from think tanks, which our opposition bench suggests are so bad, clearly have a very high impact on government policy. Governments often directly outsource to these kind of think tanks. I think it's incredibly harmful. The claim from CO is like, well, left-wing ideas are scrutinized in unis, but clearly they're scrutinized from a left-wing perspective. Our claim is that this right-wing research is not. So, what's the weighing here on these two extensions? The first thing I'm going to observe is, do we just quite neatly flip opening government? Because their claim is like, the world is overwhelmingly conservative, and the academy then is a good counterbalance. Opening government attempts to disprove this claim by saying that, well, universities are balanced to some extent, and some degree of conservatism is defensible. But closing government most clearly flips it, which is to say that we explain why the dominance of leftism at universities from opening government before that closing.
So if it's pretty easy to brand yourself as left-wing and be fake about it, surely the exclusion isn't so bad to the degree that you say it is.
No, like I think some, for instance, queer gay students still don't want to feel like they have to wear a mask, still don't want to feel like they are on the edge of being excluded from these spaces, still don't want to feel they're in a hostile environment. Incredibly unclear. So why then is our analysis about weakening the left far, far more important? I would note that the message the left sends, the way it organizes it, is independent of and prior to the reception claims from opening government. Because if the left structurally can't organize, if leftists can't make arguments in the public domain, if the message they're sending is fundamentally classist, maybe the fact that the left gets worse reception might even be, that harmful out, right? Because we want the message that is received to actually be a politically expedient and good one. That is incredibly important. Some other ways of impacting this in the round. Firstly, it's far more generous than our opening, because we explained that even if conservatism is evil, it just structurally gets way worse. And it's also far higher impact, because the opening government's claim is well, you get worse leftist research, which by their own admission, conservatives are always going to somewhat sideline, even if the degree changes to some extent. But our delta is way higher, because you just get right-wing research, which is outsourced to think tanks, which would not be outsourced otherwise, because there are obviously some incentives, for instance, for prestige, for career progression, for visibility to go to universities. Instead, it is sidelined, and that is how you get people who give papers to governments that say they can justify incredibly punitive austerity, that say trans people do not exist. That is terrible. But thirdly, the claim we give about why leftism gets worse is far better proven than opening government. Absolutely clear win for closing government.
come from a Catholic university, one that is probably more conservative than many others in the world, but I'd make the bold claim that it's still far better than Oxford and Cambridge in the 1960s, where everyone was predominantly white, where female faculty members would never have a chance for promotion, where you'd never be able to justify funding to the board looking into issues of indigenous people or looking into issues of the developing world. Insofar as there is some people who will be excluded on either side of this house, it is only in CO where we say the trade-off is worth it. Because the worst case, even if you buy the entirety of GovBench's claim, is that some center-right fucks don't get their opinions heard in class. The worst case that you trade off on Gov is that people cannot attend their classes without feeling attacked. People cannot have pride parades and organize them without being chastised in public in the streets of their own universities. The dominance is necessary because there is no other way to protect these spaces, and that is the extension. 3 things I want to talk about. First, let's defend the extension, because the one attack we hear is to say and accuse us of being derivative from opening opposition. But the problem with this is that the extent of OO is to say that, well, more bipartisanship leads to more gridlock, and sometimes Chad Foxworth gets into university, but never explains why the dynamics within university change, which answers the question from GovBench, why it has to be dominant, why it has to be 70%. Because it's not just about the moment you enter university, but it's about every micro interaction that exists and the power dynamics of who gets favored. It's about who you choose to promote and hire. It's about how much money you're willing to put into expensive sexual harassment investigation boards. It's about allowing students to engage with universities to begin with. And I want to note, they say you can get some of these on either world because some leftism will exist. No, because the incentives and the countervailing incentives to not do these things are so much higher in a world where you can tut-tut them and claim they are unimportant, where you can claim that they are unnecessary, when you can claim that they are a relic of the elite, which is why our extension stands far above this Gov case already. Let's firstly then talk about CG and eliminate their claims. They say firstly, in a similar research claim to OG, that right-wing research becomes worse when it happens in opaque think tanks. There are 2 glaring problems with this. First, they assume it's exclusive. Shady right-wing parties like the Koch brothers will continue to exist. Importantly, the glaring missing link from them is why this research moves to universities. The incentives of these funders making unfounded claims and supporting ridiculous right-wing talking points is to not be criticized, is to avoid accountability, which is why in their world they continue to fund it in these shady private organizations. But this is where the comparative gets worse, because secondly, what they get is now both this shady right-wing research in think tanks and the some amount of right-wing research that goes through universities. And this is where it becomes far more problematic, because you lend the right-wing research that happens in think tanks more credibility and the veneer of being true, because it can echo the talking points of actually decent research and say that it is an extension of it. So even in their best case, I'm unconvinced that this research being published in universities is a good thing. It becomes so much harder to dislodge it from public critique. Any criticism of it fuels conspiracy, that there's a left-wing agenda to get rid of them, which is why the research gets far worse when you have both as per CG. Alternatively, they say that by intellectualizing the left, you make it less relevant in the public eye. I have 3 responses. First, this obviously contradicts OG framing that you want more right-wing politics in the public eye. If you want the dominance of right-wing politics, then I don't see a harm to intellectualizing the left. But secondly, it's about the trade-off. I would posit that in the circles of power, in things like courts, in things like business meetings, intellectualization is necessary because education is prioritized as the basis by which people listen to you. If they don't believe that you have a level of educational attainment necessary, then you're not going to move the levers of power. So sure, some voters might be turned off. There are independent reasons those voters would be turned off from the left regardless, like failing leftist policy. But in our world, the circles are able to implement policies for themselves. It's companies implementing sexual harassment reform, even if it doesn't translate to policy. Thirdly, I'd point out that we'd prefer elites growing more leftist than elites growing more conservative and bigoted in their world, because they never engage with the counterfactual that David defends. If it's true that these people grow richer and richer, but never have the value systems instilled to them to implement the types of reforms we want, then it's unclear to me why they're any better in your world, even if they aren't seen as intellectualized. They just feel justified and feel, importantly, no need to continuously check their biases as they exit the university system, and are never critiqued by people who are still in university, which is a broad problem with them, which explains why the research environment is broadly better in our world. Let's secondly talk about OG and their research claim. Their claim is that important research doesn't get conducted as a result of certain topics being shrouded in taboo. This immediately falls on a few key grounds. First, our extension intention simply outweighs them and shows why the trade-off of research is better in our world. One, the vast majority of universities, especially in the developing world, aren't really research universities. Like, that's not the priority of their output, which is why our claims on access, quality, and protection, where all university professors have to engage, where all students are affected by what types of organizations you allow and what protections you give those organizations, immediately supersedes this. Second, the research institutions that exist outside universities, again, continue to exist, so it's non-exclusive. But thirdly, insofar as there's a trade-off, we show you why you ought prioritize minority perspectives and social causes. One, because there's far less external incentive to look into these things. There's an incentive to look at mental health on either side of the house. There's an incentive to research center-right economic policy on either side of the house. But it's incredibly difficult to look into the issues of the 1% in your state, the issues of the 30% minority who has no access to power and has nobody speaking for them. That's the delta that we uniquely demonstrate on closing opposition. Second, it's a far greater impact insofar as the studies in our world are received immediately and translate to change. This is where we deal with the reception point. We don't need everyone to listen to the research. We need this specific minority group to know what the solutions are and vote for those policies. OG.
The only response to our analysis on the counterfactual is appeal to rich students, but profit incentives are to appeal to all students and to public funding. On both sides, it's not the 50s. Right-wingers are pro-employing women and against assault. Your analysis is based on demonization.
Good thing we provided reasons other than rich students being the drivers of it. We explained that it's about the polarization and echo chamber nature of university boards. We explain it's about the things like university politics, which means the people who stand out, who are the most radical, gravitate the most attention, which is why when you think of university professors who are right-wing, you think of Jordan Peterson, and you don't think of center-right intellectuals like Milton Friedman. It's the sensationalization that these people are able to draw upon, which is uniquely the selling point of them, which is why their image predominates university discourse, which is why they become the most popular professors, why they get the most funding, and why their views become the most important. Absent a check on that power mechanism, you lose. It doesn't matter if there's universal reception for policies that are bad on your side, policies that enforce the status quo, and policies that do not lead change. We prefer protection, we prefer fairness, we prefer prioritizing the vulnerable. For those reasons, oppose.